Talk about the funding. Can you kind of lay out the funding for Lot J?
Yeah, well, first, this is a big deal for Jacksonville. It's been a long time since we've done anything really big downtown. This is going to be vertical buildings, hotel, residential, retail, and a live entertainment venue in partnership with Iguana Investments, Shad Khan's company. It's a $450 million capital investment deal. It's going to be big for our downtown. The city's going to invest in infrastructure. So starting point of all the project pieces, the live entertainment piece will be a partnership with us in the organization where the city will own that venue, and we'll lease it back to them like we do with the amphitheater and like we do with the stadium. The other vertical buildings, that property will turn over to them. They will pay property taxes on that. Those property taxes will go back into a fund that will help invest in the incentives and the infrastructure that will build the projects.
That same project in
Correct.
the area? Okay. What are the projected revenues?
So what we have right now is a term sheet, and a term sheet which says that $400+ million project, here's what the city's going to invest, here's what the partner's going to invest. That term sheet will go to city council. Before it goes to city council and the DIA, we will create what's called a development agreement. That development agreement is where we get into specifics about timelines, when will buildings go vertical, what are the property tax estimates, what are the sales tax estimates. So there will be, that agreement has not been reached and negotiated yet. That comes after the term sheet. All of that will be laid out in specificity before it goes to the Downtown Investment Authority and to the city council for approval.
And that was going to be my next question. Any kind of a timeline that you can tell us?
Well, our goal is to be shovels in the ground in January, preferably late January, because that means the team's in the playoffs. So the Hart ramp will begin to come down in January, and we would like to begin the project in that month. So that would mean the development agreement will have to be negotiated in the near term to go to the DIA and the city council. And while we want to be aggressive on timelines to get that to city council and the DIA, we want to get it right, just like we did the term sheet.
So it would coincide with the Hart Bridge coming down? Those
Correct.
would be taking place at the same time?
That's correct.
Do you know how long it would take? I don't know if you said that.
It's a multi-year project, so some of this stuff could be going out towards the end of my term. Transformational stuff that's generational, that transcends any administration or any city council. It'll be good for, it's just good for Jacksonville.
What about job creation? Any prediction?
Again, as we get into the development agreement, which will have the specificity to go to city council, that's when all that stuff will be vetted and negotiated before city council.
Do you think it was premature to make an announcement yesterday before those specifics have been worked out?
No, because we have a term sheet now, and that's an agreement. We have agreed to terms. We are now bound to these big terms, which is the big picture, which says the city's going to invest this, the Jaguars are going to invest that, and these are the buildings that we're going to build. This is what the all-encompassing pieces of this project. So it's newsworthy because we announced it, and had we not announced it yesterday or today, you guys would have done a public records request and had the term sheet and reported it. So we thought it was good for taxpayers to know we had a term sheet.
And then, so why is the city's portion as high as it is?
Look, you can't be a suburb of nowhere. Downtown has been talked about for years, and it's not a zero-sum game. Before I got into office, if you go back the year before I got in, the city had invested almost $0 in neighborhood infrastructure. My last budget did over $150 million. So we are now investing in neighborhoods all over this city. It's important at the same time that we're also committed to downtown. As I said, the live entertainment piece, that's a 50-50 investment between us and the Jaguars, our partners. The city will own that facility and lease it back to them. Many of the other incentives are based on property taxes that will be newly generated because that project exists. Right now it's a parking lot, so it's not generating any property tax. We go vertical in those buildings, it creates a property tax that goes back into the fund, which helps pay for some of the terms that we're talking about.
And then just, I know there was a cash portion that was mentioned. How will that be paid? Lump sum, over time? Is that what's part of still being worked out?
So some of that will be pay-go, which means we're financially stable. Since I've been in office, we've paid off over $300 million in debt. We reformed pension, which alleviated our operating budget. So this project will begin with, we can pay cash. At some point, We'll use debt responsibly like we always do, and when we get there, we'll take that with specificity to City Council. But at this point, there's not an immediate plan on borrowing.
And how will this impact other downtown development, like the Landing, for example?
It's good so none of this is also a zero-sum game. As we think about Bay Street, it's really not that long of a distance when you think about big cities. So I believe this will drive development all down Bay Street. I would expect by the end of this year, the Downtown Investment Authority will put a request for proposal out for the Landing. What should be there? I happen to believe that a part of it should be green space, not all of it, contrary to what some have said. I think some of it should be green space for the public, but there should also be something iconic there. What will the market bear? What are developers willing to do? And I believe when the DIA puts a proposal out, we see a whole host of ideas.
And so let me ask you, just going off of that, about the Landing. I believe the final negotiation or contract for Metro Park, when it received federal funding, part of the agreement was it couldn't be developed on unless a similar green space replaced it. Is that what you envision the Landing being?
We're not headed there right now. In fact, the focus right now on development down near the stadium is Lot J. I mean, that is where our focus is at this moment in time. We are exploring what would be the best and highest use of Met Park and the shipyards based on environmental concerns. And if we did any kind of a change there, it would have to be approved by the federal government. But my immediate focus is on taking this term sheet, getting it into a development agreement, and begin the development of Lot J in January. At the same time, having the Downtown Investment Authority, as it relates to the Landing, get a proposal out that we'll see what the market will bear there.
But has that just been a discussion at all about Metro Park being replaced? Wasn't that
I
in
mean,
negotiation?
there's discussions have happened, but that's not anything that's imminent. That's not anything that's real right now. What's real is Lot J, and then what's real by the end of the year are real ideas for what the Jacksonville Landing, the former Jacksonville Landing, that beautiful property on the river should look like and be. What should be built there?
So will any money, if JEA were to be privatized or a portion of it sold, would any funds from JEA be used to fund Lot J in any capacity?
No. In fact, let's back up. Let's talk about JEA. Two separate things. Lot J is my deal that I'm pursuing. The JEA board resolved last week that they ought to pursue recapitalization or privatization or what the best is, consider it, what it might look like. That was their decision after a one-year strategic examination about their future, because they're facing real challenges. Customer base is going, revenues are declining. In that resolution, they said the only way they would consider moving forward is if I believe it was a minimum of $3 billion in a transaction. It's also important to note that they wouldn't be able to move forward with any kind of transaction without the approval of the voters, which I support. John Crescenbenny introduced a bill last year. I supported it. You cannot make a move on JEA without the voters saying yes or no. It's ultimately in their hands. If they pursue a recap or a privatization, there's three principles that I stand by. The first is employees. I'm not supportive of seeing a bunch of employees laid off. I would not be supportive of any scenario that included that. Protecting their pensions and the benefits that have been promised to them, which is why I'm going to be introducing legislation to City Council that says in the event any changes happen at JEA, by law, their employees' pensions and promises are protected. The second principle is ratepayers. The people of Jacksonville are used to affordable electricity and clean water. That's a principle I stand by that is a must. And the third is protecting taxpayers. All three of those would have to be met for me to be supportive of any kind of a strategic change at the JEA. That said, nothing happens without the support of the voters.
So that goes into a big question I have about that change to the city charter from last year. So it says if more than 10% of JEA's assets are sold, it must go to Duval County voters. But in a memorandum from General Counsel, it said that that is cumulative. So from the beginning of time of JEA until now, and then in that memorandum, and then a Q&A between Crescenbenny and General Counsel, they said that there's a strong possibility that they've already surpassed that 10%. So it's almost like a moot point. have you heard that? Is there any plans to have a referendum or to look into that?
Look, if they pursued any kind of recap, privatization, IPO, anything that changed the ownership structure of JEA in any way, the only way I would be supportive of it is if the three things that I talked about, and it would have to go to voters. The voters get the ultimate say in this. That's where I stand.
Right, but I'm just saying that the city charter doesn't factor in that this 10% is cumulative, so we've already most likely surpassed the 10% because they're factoring everything from a truck sold 10 years ago, over time, and that was just a concern raised in the memorandum. I just didn't know if that was concern.
No, the only, not concern, but again, the thing that I stand by is that if they're going to pursue a major transaction, if they're going to pursue a transaction to change what their ownership capitalization looks like, it has to go to voters. That is where I stand unequivocally.
So just going back to really quick, my question about if JEA is sold, privatized, or a portion of it or merged, what would that funding go toward? What would the money go toward?
So the JEA board said that if the only way they would move forward is a minimum of $3 billion. And if they did that, and if they got the support of the council and the voters said yes, I would immediately pursue and suggest that the city of Jacksonville pay off all their debt. We have $1.1 billion in Better Jacksonville Plan debt. We have $1.1 billion in other debt. Pay off $2.2 billion in debt and be the first major debt-free city in the United States of America, which would change the game for all of us. What that means from a budgetary perspective is right now we spend $240 million a year in debt service payments. That would go away. So we would now have another $240 million in budgetary dollars that would A, more than replace what JEA gives the city now, and B, be able to be used in neighborhoods and parks and investments. By paying off the Better Jacksonville Plan debt, the $1.1 billion, that would trigger the immediate pension reform tax that's supposed to start in 2030. That would start immediately, which would reduce our pension liabilities by another $800 million. So taxpayers would save another $800 million in pension costs, which again could be used in the neighborhoods and their parks. That leaves another $800 million. And I would suggest that a majority of that be put in some sort of a lockbox annuity that could not be spent, but that would throw off returns to taxpayers for generations to come. But all that's hypothetical because in the end, none of this can happen if the voters don't say yes. And by the way, even if they decide they want to take a transaction to council and the voters, if it doesn't meet my three principles, I won't be supportive of it. I won't get the ultimate say, but I wouldn't be supportive of it.
Didn't the valuation in the PFM report last year and also from the DuPont study say that it could be worth up to $7 billion?
Yeah, there's been large ranges.
So it would surpass that $3 billion that you're saying is a standard of yours.
The JEA board just said that they wouldn't look at anything with a minimum of 3. I have no idea if they get into, no one ever took this conversation to a real market valuation. There were studies done a year ago, and there were only studies done because no one was willing to have a mature adult conversation about it. That conversation is happening, and there will be the market will really be able to tell you now what the value is. Is it $3 billion? Is it $6 billion? I'm starting with what JE said is the minimum, and if they get the minimum in the city, I'm going to pay off all the city debt, and protect a majority of those dollars.
Even if that's in like the $3-4 billion?
Sure, absolutely. My principles remain the same.
Okay. And I was going to ask you about how this does differ from a year and a half ago when we did get the valuation. How would this valuation be different from that time?
They're going to market now. Like they're asking companies, what's the value, which is completely different, right? So a realtor can come to your home and tell you that they believe your home is X. Your home is worth, once you look at it and see what your home is worth, what somebody says, I'll pay you this or I'll pay you this. So what happened a year ago were studies by professionals based on calculations and numbers. But in the end, negotiations and transactions in the market will drive the value. And that's what they're pursuing now.
So I do have a question. From an April 2018 interview I had with Aaron Zahn, I put it in quotes, and I can send it to you later if you want to see it. I just want to ask you about it. I asked him, quote, so talks of privatization are over. He said, quote, as far as I understand, the mayor and the city council have all come to an agreement on that. Do you think he spoke too soon when he said that? Because now we're looking at it again today.
No, I put out a statement, that was April of 2018, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and I put out a statement that said I would not be introducing any legislation on privatization. Aaron Zahn was the new CEO at the time, and he was charged with the task to examine the strategic future and longevity and the survival of the JEA. And he's done that. And he's laid out multiple options. I think one of the options he said is stay as we are and lay people off. There's no scenario that I support people getting laid off, by the way. That can't happen. One of them was to change, I believe, to change the charter or go to the state and see how else they could do business so they're not constrained in a way that the municipalities are constrained to compete with the market. The other one was, let's see what's our value. Look, it's reasonable to always know the real value of your asset, what the market will really bear, and what your asset's going to be worth in the years ahead. You have an organization that's got an increasing customer base and declining revenues. Anybody running a business under that scenario, if you're a small business, a family business, you'd be scared to death if your customer base was growing and your revenues were declining.
And I understand, I remember you said you weren't going to introduce any more legislation, but can you understand how that might be a confusing statement when I said talks are over, and he said the mayor and city council have come to an agreement on that, and then here we are again?
No,
talking
because
about it?
he led the charge over the last year of the strategic future of Jacksonville, or of the JEA, and has come to the conclusion with the board. He laid out a plan to the board, and they had multiple options. And by the way, I think they made a wise decision to say, what does this look like? It doesn't mean you're going to act. By the way, and in the end, it doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what the city council thinks, with all due respect to them, and all due respect to myself, in the end, if they decide to pursue this, the voters will get the final say. The voters. Democratic vote.
And how closely would you say you've been working with Zahn and JEA over the past year?
Not at all.
So the reason I asked this is because I received this actually just about an hour ago. It's this strategic framework put together last year, and it talks about you being a shareholder and you needing to align at all times with JEA relative to financial, operational, and community expectations. And this was last year, shortly after I sat down with Zahn and shortly after we thought privatization talks were over. So it seems like it says you have to be in alignment with them. So it seems like wouldn't that mean that you would have to talk with them along the whole time?
I'm assuming he's suggesting, like any independent agency, that ultimately they're an agency of the city of Jacksonville and there ought to be some alignment. But they have an independent board. He's the CEO of that organization. He's got a president of that organization. They go about their day-to-day business without my input, and they've gone about this strategic examination without my input, as it should be. If they decide to pursue some radical change or some new path, which is privatization or capitalization, I have my principles that I'll stand by, that I'll evaluate that on. As I've just laid out, if dollars came into the city, exactly how they'd be spent. But in the end, nothing can happen without the say of the voters, which was a bill presented by John Cressenbenny that I supported then, that I continue to support. I would not be supportive of any change in ownership or capitalization of JEA without the voters making the ultimate decision.
It is interesting that now that it's up to the voters, they are being offered a possible $1,400 rebate. Do you think that in any way is somewhat of an incentive?
I'll leave it up to them to answer. By the way, that's a lot of money for people. Hardworking people every day trying to put clothes on their kids' back, feed them. But that's their decision. I wouldn't. I have my principles. My principles don't include a rebate or not, one way or the other.
So whether or not you've been involved or what your involvement has or hasn't been, what would you say JEA's biggest obstacle is?
They have a growing customer base, declining revenues. They have major liabilities on a nuclear power plant that seem to be unlimited at this point in time. The market's changing. They have inherent constraints because they're a municipality. They can't compete with organizations that aren't municipalities. And the market's just changing rapidly and radically. What you don't want to happen is you don't want to do nothing and wake up 5 years, 8 years, 10 years from now, and people are either being laid off, which Aaron Zahn has said it would have to happen, he believes, as the leader of the organization, or the kind of layoffs that nobody really sees happening, whereas people retire and they just don't replace them. And you wake up one day and you have an organization that is not profitable and is not employing people and can't compete in the market.
And you mentioned constraints, because that's what Zahn said over and over was his biggest concern. So is that what you're saying to you, the constraints from
I mean, look,
statute?
I am no energy expert. That's why there's an independent board over there and a CEO. But so just like in public safety, when the sheriff tells me or the state attorney tells me challenges or constraints they have, and they come to me and they ask me for resources or options, I take and follow their advice because they're the experts. So at a basic level, I understand that a growing customer base, declining revenue, unlimited nuclear liability is a big, big business problem and a big risk. As far as market constraints, when the experts tell me that, I take them at their word.
We do have to try to wrap. I'm sorry, we do have to try to wrap up just because we've got three more.
Oh, shoot,
I'm sorry,
okay.
guys.
How many, what do I have, like a couple more questions? Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems a lot of citizens, at least I've spoken with, are not in support of privatization. Why not hold some kind of town hall meeting, Q&A, to gauge public opinion on this?
The public will ultimately have the final say. I mean, they will vote if this goes that direction. If the JEA suggests that this is the path to travel, the only real public opinion that matters is a vote. So they'll vote yes or they'll vote no, and that's how it should be.
And then just my last question kind of encompasses a couple of things, but why are we so quickly moving forward with putting millions toward an entertainment district, and we can put a vote toward city council, but we're so slow and hesitant, I feel like, to put millions toward our school system and put a vote toward Duval County voters?
So the Lot J terms will not go to city council until there's a development agreement, and that development agreement will have all the specificity in it. How the dollars will be spent, when they'll be spent, what are the timelines, when will the buildings go vertical, as it should be. That's how all my projects I take to city council and the DAA are. At this moment in time, if you have a neighborhood public school, they cannot tell you if they pass this tax what they will do to your school, what the time, when are they going to do it? Are they going to do it year one? Is it going to be 5 years, 10 years? And what will your school ultimately look like? That most basic of questions hasn't been answered. So when I'm in public and I'm talking to people, and I've heard the same thing from Council President Scott Wilson with his constituents, he and I have had numerous conversations. People understand, I agree and understand, our schools need to be invested in, and they've had long been neglected, which is a whole other question. Decades of neglect, and we're just hearing about it. That said, we have to deal with it. But you're going to ask people to pay a tax to do this, and you can't tell them when their neighborhood school will be invested in and by what timeline. That's a problem.